About 4 months ago, I started down a rabbit hole. A pretty deep rabbit hole, actually. I'm not entirely sure how I came to the point where every other suggested YouTube video was about fashion history, but here we are. I came across a channel by a Polish woman named Karolina Zabrowska, who has had a large influence on my interest in fashion history these past few months. I watched a video by her entitled, "Why Did We Stop Wearing Hats?" which was my inspiration for this speech. So today I'm going to talk to you about why we don't wear hats anymore. I'm going to talk about some things that Carolina mentioned in her video, as well as some other things that I found in further research. People have been wearing hats for much of the Earth's history. However, the 1900s held one of the biggest revolutions in fashion history ever, especially for women. Hats were used for practical reasons, warmth, shade, etc., as well as social and religious purposes. For women, the last century started with hand-sewn, full-length dresses over petticoats and corsets and elaborate hats, and it ended with this. For men, it started with black or gray suits, white collared shirts and top hats, and ended with any colored suits, any colored shirts, and no hats. Though it should be noted that men didn't always wear suits, it wasn't out of the ordinary, and the main look remained remarkably similar. Hats were one of the many things to change with women's fashion, and one of the few things to change with men's fashion. One thing is for sure, no one wears them like they used to. So let's look at where it all started. World War I. World War I was the beginning of the decline in hat wearing. The vast majority of people still wore them, but with everything going on in the world, it was becoming a little bit less of a sin to not wear your hat. When you're working on the farm and dealing with a husband and two sons at war, then making sure that your hat is in place and pinned in right and doesn't make your hair look funny is the least of your concerns. The Great Depression started about 11 years after World War I ended, and it wasn't much different. I'm not sure why, but Carolina didn't mention this in her video, but I think it's pretty important, so I'm going to talk a little bit about it. With money being tight for everyone, there wasn't enough to buy the most fashionable and recent styles. They might still wear their old hats, but they probably couldn't afford to buy any new ones. And again, a national/worldwide crisis meant you could be forgiven for not putting on your hat every once in a while. World War II had pretty much the same effect as World War I, but the result was a bit larger because hats were already declining. But people still wore hats. But people still wore hats. Even with everything happening in the world at the time, cities being bombed, children being evacuated, etc., Carolina says, and yet wearing hats was still such a basic aspect of life that people chose to do it even in the most difficult conditions. Younger people, however, didn't wear them as much, especially in the summertime. After the war, there was a bittersweet reaction towards wearing hats. On one hand, women were excited to finally be able to keep up with the latest fashion trends again with hats. On the other hand, the war made them realize that they weren't as important as they thought they were, which carried into the 1950s and through the 1950s. And with men, well, many of them didn't want to wear hats anymore because they had to in the army. And wearing hats reminded them of the hard times, as fashion journalist Matt Pomeroy said. In the 1960s, fashion changed a lot. While fashion designers were having a hard time figuring out where to go next. While fashion designers were having a hard time figuring out where to go next, they realized a new target: teenagers. With younger people as the new target audience for fashion instead of adults, skirts were getting shorter, silhouettes were all over the place, and so were the patterns and colors. People were no longer being governed by laws of fashion. They were doing their own thing. And Carolina says, because suddenly the point of fashion wasn't to be elegant anymore, it was to be cool. Hats were doomed. Elegance wasn't cool anymore, and neither were hats. This is about where Carolina ends her video on the history of hats, of how hats went out of fashion, but I'm not quite done yet, because upon doing more research, I found another very important reason why we no longer wear hats today that Carolina didn't touch on at all. And I'm not gonna lie, I felt a little betrayed. But I think the main reason she didn't include this vital piece of information as to why we don't wear hats anymore is because her main target audience is women. All of the research I did that showed this particular reason as only pertaining to why men stopped wearing hats. But I think it is important for both men and women. Cars, I think, were the biggest reason that we stopped wearing hats and that hats went away. Many people think that JFK is the reason men don't wear hats today. This is because every president up until him wore a hat to his inauguration. While Kennedy wore one on his way there, he took it off before the actual event. And it should be noted that after that, more men than ever, including balding men, began to go without hats. Radio and TV journalist Robert Krulwich, however, thinks that Dwight D. Eisenhower was really the president who de-hatted America. In the 1950s, Eisenhower built a highway across the nation. Before this, people would walk to work or take public transportation, both of which had a lot of headroom. Now, with the highways connecting more places, people could get jobs in other cities and use their own cars to get there. And if they didn't already have one, then they could buy one for that particular purpose. Cars were invented in 1885. However, they only slowly became widely available to the public. Cars had lower roofs that made it so one would have to take off his or her hat as soon as they got inside. So it made hats less practical as more people bought cars. Fashion journalist Matt Pomeroy said, looking at US figures, in 1920, less than 1% of the population owned a car. By 1940, that rose to around 1 in 4 people. By 1970, it was around 55%. Hats weren't as sensible as they used to be when people would have to walk around in the rain and snow and the sun. Now with their cars, they can brave the elements for a few seconds before being safe on their journeys to wherever they're going. In short, hats weren't practical anymore, and they didn't fit in with the new looks that the teenagers were after. These days, it's head-turning to wear anything other than, let alone fancier than, a baseball cap or beanie. But even those people don't wear very often. And as much as I'd personally like to see people wearing these again, I don't think it will happen. Rip hats.